Welcome back to the work session for March 26th of the Pinehurst Village Council. Welcome back, Dr. Morgan. Uh, the let's the item on the agenda is to discuss the process for capital item inclusion in the 5-year strategic operating plan. Councilman Taylor has mentioned this on a few occasions, so has other members of the council. So I'm going to turn to you, John, and for now.
I think this is in part an outgrowth of my desire to see us talk about one strategic topic every work session, whatever it might happen to be. And this is one that I think is timely because it will certainly come up as part of the budget process that we begin next month. And I guess what I would say as I thought about this is, despite being a data-rich environment, which we clearly are, I have felt in observing past councils, and I've heard from members of the public, that from their perspective, the current process by which ideas get generated and then how do they move from an idea to either a shovel in the ground or not is fuzzy. And I think we can improve the process. And I was probably, as much as anything, motivated in this by the letter that we all received from former Councilwoman Judy Davis, who, among other things, said, do something with my money. I was talking with Jack about this separately. You know, how long has the library been on the agenda? Now, the circumstances changed when the village took over the library. This really became a catalyst to say we got to get something done. But there's been discussion of this, depending on who you want to talk to, for 5 or 10 or maybe 20 years or longer than that. And that's too long for us to make a decision. And to a certain extent, from the public comment we got, we have the money, and we, consistent with staff resources that are necessary for any of these things, we should be doing things. We are a decision-making body, and we should be able to make some decisions. That doesn't mean we can do everything next year, or that we should, even if we could. So what I thought was that we might, as much as in some ways the balanced scorecard provides a bit of a roadmap for this, and some of our I'm going to get the acronyms mangled. Not so much the OFIs, but the areas of additional focus, which I can't come up with the correct acronym there.
IAPs.
IAPs and yes. So what I thought I would lay out kind of my thoughts for how the process ought to work as what I doubt will generate any sort of decision tonight, but what might lead us to an improved process and streamline getting from an idea to either dismissing it because we don't think it makes sense, rather than keeping it out there 5 years and in the next budget cycle we keep it out there and we don't make a decision, or maybe accelerating the time that we actually get it accomplished. So I just, I wrote down roadmap to go from idea to execution. How do we shorten the decision-making process? How do we make sure, for example, that a parking structure, which was once on this, no longer is, but everyone I think would agree that parking is still a topic very much on our residents' minds, certainly on our business owners' minds. That we may not have a solution for that, so it may have to linger a little bit. But other things, maybe we should just decide yes or no. So I wrote down sort of the following 7 steps. The first is, what is the need for the project? How was that need identified? What is the background information? That could come from staff. That could come from council. That could come from the public. Either are possible. Secondly, how do we assess what the potential benefits of a project? How do we evaluate that? And sometimes there's a financial component to that, but not always. I think Jeff Morgan, some of the comments that he made in our December retreat about the benefits to improve response time when the call is not for a fire, but for a heart attack or a stroke, that really resonated with me. I can't put a dollar figure on that. Maybe some employee of an insurance company somewhere can. But I would have no problem saying to any member of the public, that's why I think we ought to put a third facility somewhere and staff it in some way, because that's an obvious benefit to the public. And I think would reduce response times in the aggregate. I don't know how much. We're not at a decision point there, but that is clearly something, that discussion is something I would like to see accelerated, personally, in part because it's only, the longer we wait, the more it's going to cost. And however we decide to finance it, putting something, right now, I think we've got it out in fiscal 28 or 29. That's just going to cost more money than if we could do it next year or the year after that. I don't know which. And again, that we come back to staff resource, I'm fully cognizant of that. Third is what objective, or what criteria are necessary to move through the steps from conception to design. And that might fit well with our OFIs and what have you. Secondly, what objective process do we need to respect in moving a project from one stage to another down a decision-making road to either kill it or stick a shovel in the ground? And by the way, just to be clear, I'm talking about the capital projects. They're not what I would call annual maintenance. We prudentially must allocate certain funds for road maintenance every year. We'd be silly if we didn't. I'm talking about the more the one-time,
like that.
you know, library, community center, things like that. Third, how do we prioritize this new project that's been introduced or the existing projects now? If we had to take the ones we already have, how would we prioritize those? I would have my list. That's just one list, and other people would have others. But I think if you don't prioritize it, it becomes a reason to not make a decision. Whereas if you prioritize and say, X is more important than Y, that moves you down the direction of saying, well, when could we do X, and how would we finance X? Fourth, what are the current costs, and how might those costs change in the future? It's easy to assume that anything will cost more in the future than it will tomorrow. Maybe there's some things where that's not true. I don't know. It's just a question that needs to be asked. Finally, what are the staff resources, not finally, but what are the staff resources that are required? How does that filter into existing workloads? And that is certainly can be a constraint on what is possible and has to be factored in. How do we finance it? That deliberately is number 6 on the list. It's probably the least important decision up front. But somewhere down the road, you got to ask the question, because as I pointed out, we have more on our current wish list than we have capital to do it. But we have the capacity in various ways, as we heard in a previous presentation from Dana, on how we could finance. And the last thing is there really a project captain, either on council or on the staff, someone who really believes that this is important and is willing to shepherd it, if you will, so that it doesn't just get lost in the morass. I think if we can improve, it's not to say that we don't do any of these things. I think maybe we haven't been as intentional about them as we can be. And I think if we do that, we will create not only improved transparency for our own decision-making and for the allocation of staff resources, but it will be improved transparency to the public. There are some corollary tentacles to this. Should we have a long-term policy on debt? Or do we just kind of ad hoc every time there's something come up, we say, how do we want to finance it? Is it the sort of asset that we should finance using debt? Should we pay for it out of existing capital? That half and half doesn't have to be 100-0. So those were my thoughts as background to the discussion. There may or may not be an actual action item that comes out of this. I'm happy to serve as project captain to further refine this, subject to input from Jeff, yourself, or my fellow council members.
Comments from Barb or Jack or thoughts?
As I look at the list of projects that we got, I think that having some criteria around determining which are the priorities would be important. Some of what concerns me about what's on here on the list is that I know some of these numbers came from thin air. And if we are going to prioritize and we're going to seriously put these in some kind of order, we need to have more realistic numbers with them, I think, to the extent that we can. So I'm simply saying I agree with
Strikes
your.
me that, I mean, that comment, and I understand the comment, but it's very similar to the point that John brought up earlier today about the number that's in the STIP for the traffic circle, right? It's
Yes.
nothing more than a placeholder, because until you actually design something, you aren't gonna know what the actual cost is. And I think it's fair to observe that maybe we can put a little bit more diligence into determining what those placeholders are, and certainly our experience with the cost escalation on the library has kind of bit us all in the pants in that regard. But it really is. Those numbers that are in the 5-year plan for the out years have always intended to be placeholders for it's a rough order of magnitude of costs that we think we need to be able to support in our long-term budgeting and taxation and revenue and cost strategy.
Jeff, thank you. I think what it will do is it will enforce a discipline on council to keep these numbers current, so the library doesn't sit at
Update them every
$3.5
year,
million
right.
year after year after, and all of a sudden it's not three and a
I think
half,
that's
it's
a
not even
very
4.5.
fair observation is that we've not updated that,
It's a better discipline for us.
and for us.
Yep,
We gotta
both,
we have
right.
to bring you the updated numbers.
Jack, did you want to say?
And Barbara, if I could, obviously, some of the things, I did get that same list that, of capital needs, and some of the, stormwater improvements, walkways and sidewalks, that's really not the kind of thing that I'm talking about, because they're going to be more ongoing expenses, but yes, thank you for raising this list.
I think it's useful to take a look at our list of capital projects, and I'll use that term rather broadly, but to test them against what you talked about, John, which is, in other words, has a need been identified, and how is it identified, and how is it articulated and documented and agreed to? Have the benefits been evaluated, and how have they been evaluated? Is there some objective criteria that causes the project to move to the next stage? And I'll use maybe I use the third firehouse, fire station, EMT, whatever it's going to be, as an objective. Maybe if there is data that specifically demonstrates that the curve to response time or something is going to approach an unacceptable level, then that triggers the project moving to another level, which is, RFQ or so forth. So in other words, are there objective criteria that move the project to the next stage of seriousness, from idea to all the way down to shovel in the ground? And sometimes the objective isn't necessarily data-driven as much as, I'll use the library as an example of where everyone felt we needed one. Everyone felt we needed a more facility and so forth and so on. But until we did the consultant study, which came back to demonstrate, these are the needs that the communities express. This is the size of the needs. This is the, and so forth and so on. And this is what you need to do to satisfy that need. Until that at least gave us some criteria to move forward on the library with some reasonably objective criteria. So I think against every one of these projects, I think that's the type of thing that should be had. There should be some criteria to move it from an idea to a want to an actual in place, and move on to the next step, which is to prioritize it against the other projects, which is this is in my writing, fourth step, and then cost it against the potential costs. So I think that process that you've outlined is useful to judge each one of our lists of projects, capital projects, to see where they stand in that process. So I think it's a useful way to go about assessing capital projects.
Yeah, I want to thank you for, again, forcing this onto the calendar, because it helps focus our minds and our attention on things that too often will collectively, I'll say this, and then sort of shrug shoulders, and we'll go on to other issues, or things will go into the back burner, and we really don't address the subject at hand. I think accurate cost forecasting is vital because it builds confidence in the decisions we make. And when we're too off base, there's always a variance in government contracting and government awards and buildings and whatever. But when you're too far outside the 40-yard lines, you're having a tendency, a credibility gap with your constituents, and you may have a financial gap with the balance in your account. We happen to be in an envious position that we've accumulated quite a bit of money in our reserve fund over the past few years. I think when coming to prioritizing, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so, to me, that is sort of the starting point of how do we determine what we're going to focus on. And the first thing I think we always used to look at things at is address the problems that are in front of us right away. How do we handle that which is right there and the problem that we as a community need to address and solve? Secondly, head off the apparent future problems that may not be looking us in the face, but they're right there on the side, peering at us, winking at us. And then look at the sort of the, I'll call it wish list, desire list, whatever it is, of other items. I think that it's very important to factor in what our citizens are thinking based on what we know from not anecdotal discussions with people, which is one source of input, but the survey data that we've had for years that I find myself paying more and more attention to. I was a skeptic when I was on the council at the beginning because I, for various reasons, didn't have a lot of confidence in the data because my grandmother was on the survey list. But eventually I grew to just keep reading it, and it was revealing. It tells a story as to various projects. Here they were, then they went this way, then they came this way. And so I think citizen input through those surveys, through meetings with citizens is very important. I also think that in the end, when you have the final product of whatever it is, it could be a new sidewalks, whatever it is, you really want the residents, you want the project that you've completed to be an object of their affection rather than a subject of their criticism. And so you got to think about that as you're putting stuff together. If there's a lot of criticism while you're going through it, you can surprise everybody with a great outcome, or you're going to have people who are forever, poo-pooing what may well be a very serious effort of something that was necessary. The other thing is I think we have to keep in mind that we are the village of Pinehurst, and that is our world that we need to help solve and correct things in. I think if we start to think beyond our borders too much, we're assuming certain responsibilities that really aren't our responsibilities. Certainly not something that our taxpayers need to assume. We got that sort of punch in the face a couple of weeks ago when we heard about the water tax rates that are going to be going upward for several years now. It's a fact of life. We need water. I've had people say to me, "What are you going to do about that?" I said, "Well, we're going to make sure you can keep taking a bath because we need water." But that wasn't in our forecasting. Not that it should be. I don't know why it would have been, to be honest with you. Certainly wasn't in my forecasting. on wild days, boy, we're going to have a big water rate increase. But it's no longer make-believe. We're on the cusp of that, evidently. If you just read the papers, the number one state in America for high healthcare costs is North Carolina. If you look at your utility bill, they got a utility tax line there now. It's been there for a while, but it's been inching up. My last one was 6.5%. That's what it turned into. If you, we just raised the average property tax rate on a property owner in Pinehurst by 10.9%. And we're, what are we, 3 years away from the next property reevaluation by Moore County. So all those things have to be put into the equation as we figure out how to prioritize, which is a good phrase, the laundry list of things, some of that have been around a long time, some that have been around not as long, and we've got to weigh all that as we get to a list that prioritizes things. I think the argument that today it's always going to cost more in the future. Well, it's always going to cost more in the future, except if you were like me in the 5th grade and the kid next to you, parents bought him a $100 handheld calculator. If you waited a couple of years, you could get a handheld calculator for about $5, and you were on equal footing with that kid. But in general, things always cost more in the future. It's what happens. But I don't buy that. That's the reason to spend as heavily as you can right now. I think you got to be cautious. I think one of the reasons we've been able to, as a community, to accumulate a lot of funds is that we've been pretty cautious. And some will say we took too much time on certain projects. Probably did. I think most of the projects that were completed are the object of a lot of people's affection rather than the subject of too much criticism. So, that's all.
Are we able to take comments from Dr. Morgan?
I don't think so, but
Okay. Let's offer him the chance if we can, but.
Yeah, I did notice that you have been able to change your settings from the Grand Teton Mountains to looks like downtown New York. So you've got very mobile. Oh, that's Chicago.
That's Chicago.
Okay.
Used to be the Sears Tower behind it.
Okay.
I mean, if I would, oh, sure.
can I provide some observations? I didn't write down your list there, John. When you were reading that list, it struck me as a combination of different things. There were steps in there and there were considerations.
Sure.
But I also, as I listened to that list of steps and considerations, I kept coming back to the opinion that all of the things that in our current capital plan, capital projects, large capital projects, more or less have been subject to all of those steps and all of those considerations already. And it goes back to the point that I've tried to make a couple of months ago when this first question first came up, that our processes already do this. And maybe there's room to create more rigor with a policy statement or something like that that outlines these thoughts and considerations, and we can kind of check it off and make sure that for all of these things that we actually have gone through these processes. But I do think it's true that our processes have taken every one of our projects that are in the plan right now through those steps and considerations. And I just ask you all to consider what happens when you all take the current list of things through those steps of processes and then considerations, and then 2 or 3 new council members are elected and they're not aware of the past. And we're going back and doing the same thing. Every year, a key aspect of what we ask you to do in the strategic retreat in December is to reprioritize these projects and to figure out where potential new things that have been identified fit into that scheme. This is an annual cycle that we're going through in terms of reprioritizing the things that have already been through the other considerations.
Let me push back slightly. Right now, we have a fire ladder truck on the list for fiscal year '27 and a Fire Station 93 on the list for fiscal year '28 or '29. Does that imply that we as council think that the fire truck is more important than the station?
No, and we had this conversation during the strategic retreat. It's a recognition that if we're going to follow through on that, it's going to take 3 years to build that fire truck.
No, I understand.
So if we were going to do it and have it be part of that overall outcome, then we needed to have the money in the plan in 27, was it 27?
27, yes.
Yeah.
I think, I agree that the right time to go through this process you've defined is in the strategic retreat, in December. I mean, you don't want to be doing this every month, clearly.
No.
But you should be able to ask the questions for every single project that John just articulated. Has the need been identified? Can we describe the Venetip? Are there objective criteria that have been used to evaluate the project to give it some reality? How are we prioritizing it against the others? So in other words, these questions, these 5 or 7 questions, I think are reasonable to ask. That's clearly the best time to do it. Now, it takes some time to do that, and you may have to go through the list again.
Yeah.
But I think those are the right questions to ask in that retreat. And that's
Considerations,
probably the right
yeah.
time to do it, too, as a matter of fact. We don't want to do it 3 times a year, I guarantee you that. So, you really need to do it in December because the budget cycle takes quite a considerable amount of time to put together, to be ready for the,
I mean, if I were to take of this list and put my own priorities on it, the library would be number one, just because we got to make that decision, and we will in the next 4 to 6 weeks, I think, probably.
And we're contractually obligated to do it.
Well, there are those who
Like
dispute that, but whether
this
we are
coming
or not,
fiscal year.
we got to check this off. We got to make a decision.
Yeah.
Right. I would put Fire Station 93 personally as number 2, not out in 28, 29. The synthetic turf, we've got 2 projects really there, and I'd probably put that 3rd. The public services relocation, I would put 4th. I would love to accelerate that, but that timing is not entirely within our control because we got to find some place to go. And if something were to change, that could change these priorities. And the ladder truck would be number 5, understanding that there is a lead time for how long it takes to build these things.
Yeah.
That's just personal. But for the first couple, if we haven't already identified what we would have to do to decide whether to actually do that and make that a reality and decide in what fiscal years, do we have to put the Fire Station 93 off till fiscal 28 or 29? I personally would like to see it done sooner than that because I think the benefit is pretty obvious. And we already talked about that being debt funded, whether we do that or not. Obviously, right now, we would have the capital to do it, but we might decide not to spend that capital anyway. So, yeah, I think what I'm proposing, and maybe the time to do it is December, I found that as a new council member, I found the December process too rushed to do it in the way that I think we should. I agree we should only do it once a year, and if that's the right time, then maybe we just
You don't
need
have
to
any background. I mean, you're walking in
Right.
cold. It's
And every
Yeah.
2 years, somebody's walking in cold,
Yeah.
probably,
Yeah.
unless people run for reelection. I do think, in response, Jeff, to your observation that council turns over, if we are better at laying down the thought process that got us there, it's not to say a new person can't walk in and want to upset the apple cart, but it will give them a context for how we got to where we are. You're never going to solve it
To your earlier
entirely.
point, I mean, and Jack's as well, is if we have this list of considerations, if we formalize it, make it part of the process in December, then when you walk in as new council members, you know that, hey,
Right.
we're revisiting all these questions, and you're hearing what substantiated that project being on the current list that you're consideration,
Right,
you're considering.
As I think I said earlier, I think we have a good part of this in place
Yeah.
in the existing system, but I think, and maybe it's incumbent on council primarily, to sharpen our focus on these things and be sure that the things that are on here, that our goal is not to just perpetuate things forever, but it's to make decisions and then decide when can those decisions be implemented based on the combination of factors that we discussed. And it's possible that what I'm suggesting is really a criticism of council not having done that in the past, as opposed to any criticism at all of staff not having laid these things out in a way that we could. That's entirely possible.
So I think one of the most important parts of this is step number 2, which is what are the benefits? In order to, I couldn't tell you the benefits, for example, right now of moving public services. It's more than necessarily a financial decision. In order to understand and evaluate benefits, you have to understand and evaluate what your strategic vision is, so that other issues that are important are factored into your decision. And I think that piece is missing. Certainly for me, walking into the December meeting, cold, it was very difficult. And I could not, at this point in time, do a very good job of determining which of these is my number 1, 2, or 3 priority, because I don't know what the benefits are. So it is really critical. I think it's a critical thing for us to do. When we do it is critical, but there is a piece that precedes it, which is a strategic vision.
I lost my train of thought.
I'm
It'll
sorry,
come
I
back
kept
to me. No, no.
I'm going to piggyback a little bit on the priority issue. With the exception of the library, which is a commitment and a priority, I think all those other remaining projects, some of which began as plugs and now grown up, and they're in their teenage years and getting ready to get a driver's license and all, we need to give some scrutiny to them. In December, it was a fire station, but when we left that meeting, it was more an emergency management type location, not a full-fledged fire station, because we realized that the fires are a small part of what our fire department does. They're responding to emergency calls that are not fire-related. I think the number I saw was 4% in the last data, which are actually fire-related of the 1,100 calls they get. So that's a different way to look at that need. And you go back to the fire truck discussion, it was on a budget 2 years ago, and the staff took it off the budget, now it's back on the budget. We had a parking garage once in there for a few years, now it's off. I think we need to look at the other ones that are not. The library is set apart, as far as I'm concerned. We have a contractual agreement. We've actually made progress as to a potential, actual site and a style. We're waiting for some feedback from our architects and before we readdress it. So, but the issue there is, it goes back to what Barb mentioned, is the true sticker shock for our residents regarding what they were told and what the council was told, what everyone was told, to what it's evolving into. So we've got to find a way to pay for this new permanent recurring cost to our budget in a way that doesn't require us to put a lot more burden on the backs of our taxpayers, given that we know they're being hit for water, insurance, auto rates, and all that in the future. There's two sides to that ledger. There's the revenue and expenditure side. And we've really got to look at both of those rather than just say, I like this. A lot of things I like in this list, but how do I prioritize it? Well, vis-a-vis things, I've got the library, and then I got, the others are sort of somewhat in the starting gate to me. And I've got to be convinced as to how much we ought to spend on them, if at all, in some cases. I'm a big skeptic of the fire truck that we hardly use, and when we need one, we borrow it from Southern Pines or Aberdeen, and there's a logic to that because they have it. Each of them have one, and we don't. But, and I really want to drill down more on the data about fires versus the non-fire responses. We don't need a fire station if what we really are talking about is responding to emergency health situations. And so I'm looking forward to some of that data.
I recovered
Well,
my,
you bring up the point, which I think is important, which should be added to that process, is the complete description of the project, of the capital project, whatever it is. I mean, an agreed upon description of what it is, because over time, the description can change, because the description will generate the needs and the benefits and objective criteria and how to prioritize and how to cost. I mean, so we need a clear description of the project every step of the way that is agreed upon, because without that,
Kind of the scope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recovered my train of thinking, and Barbara, you touched on it, and I didn't want to broaden this too much because we discussed comp plan a little while ago. Presumably, many, but not all of the needs will be driven from something that is in the comprehensive plan, something that a longer-term goal that we've said we want to achieve. Now, some of them, like expanding the ETJ north of 211, okay, we can check that box. So we attempted that, didn't work. Maybe we'll revisit it some other time. I don't know. And not all of them, because a lot of other things, they're not generated by a big picture strategic goal. So there will be a combination of those things. And I think the problem, and maybe this is just a time budgeting of doing it in December, is at least, and maybe my experience will be different this coming December, a lot of the December exercise was, here's what we said last year, here's staff recommended changes, what do you all want to do about that? That doesn't let you take a step back and introduce, well, it doesn't preclude you introducing brand new things, but the process itself has a certain momentum, and when you don't understand it, you're hard pressed to swim against that tide. But in principle, you could. That is the time for someone to say, hey, what about this? We're not even talking about this, and should that get into the process at this point? And there aren't any OFIs for it yet, because nobody thought of it before that. But
I mean, for example, if my memory serves me, when the carriage house was reintroduced into our capital plan several years ago, it happened as a result of a conversation between staff and council during the retreat. It wasn't a staff input. It was just a recognition of what to do, and it was tied to the library and where we were in that process and negotiating that outcome. So it does happen, but I mean, to our earlier point, when we have newcomers on the council that don't have all the history and the perspective, it's hard. I think it's hard for you to be, hitting the ground running with all that stuff. And I think you'll find that having the benefit of your leadership for this past year, when you enter that process again next fall and winter, you're going to have a lot more background perspective that allows you to help us all wrestle with those important decisions.
I'm getting ready for another session with Matt now that I have his flow chart, and
Yeah.
my level of understanding will be greater in December than it is today.
Yeah.
I thank him in advance, so.
Thoughts?
well, I'd like to see you, John, document this, quote, process and steps so that we can, evaluate and staff can take a look at it and see how well it fits with what we're doing today, or what.
Are there any
what-
holes? Yeah.
What additions or enhancements can be made and how we can use it to assess projects in the going forward, but I think it'd be quite useful.
And it may be that the real major outcome is just better discipline on us, that we ask these questions as we go along, because in many cases, the data is certainly there. We're not data poor, and if it's a new topic and we need to go collect it, well, we have the ability to do that, so.
But I would add some reasonable definition of what the project is, because I guarantee you, the word new library can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, you know? And as it moves through the process, we ought to be locked into what the council thinks a new, quote, new library
Well,
means.
in fairness, the scope changed. Scope changed on February 14th.
Well, I'm not saying the scope can't change.
23. The scope before that was over on the Village Green.
Right.
That was the
That's where it
contract we let.
started, yeah.
That was the dollar amount associated with it. And then we had the National Park Service discussion, or
Yeah.
their opining in general. And you can look at February 14th, 2023 session, and you can watch it. I rewatched it a week or so ago, and you can see the entire discussion of how we went from there to looking at sites.
Therefore, the definition should be updated, and everyone should agree to what the new definition
Right.
is.
But the council did that. But that new scope sort of reached the citizens, let us say, in fairness, because as we all know, to this day, there are people who are so surprised that we're going to not have it on the Village Green, if that's what the outcome eventually is.
But I've been sitting here thinking about the concept of how do we also improve transparency to the public, because I don't think they see the December session.
Right, yeah.
But that having been said, if we are clear as we come out of the December session on what we're going to do, as we then begin to discuss the specifics of that, that will become clear in these meetings and these work sessions, so.
Well, I think
The strategic plan, as printed and documented, if you read the capital project section, is a very good description of capital projects, but it's a little bit later than the December session, for sure.
Right.
Well, yeah, the next strategic operating plan we adopt will be, I think, should be, as clear as possible to our residents as to what the roadmap going.
I will try to
future is.
flesh this out and circulate it all for consideration.
Yeah,
with
that would be
yourself.
helpful,
We'll
thanks.
include Matt
Yeah.
and anyone else who should see it, so.
Yeah, please draft something up that we can play with.
Good.
and
Thank you for your
discuss.
time and consideration.
Okay. Other business that anyone would like to bring up? I know one thing I'm going to raise. I believe we're going to get our budget, I'll call it our budget book. I'm dating myself. The budget presentation in May. When will we get the book?
The draft SOP,
Yeah, and the whole thing.
early May,
Okay.
right? Yeah, like the first meeting, before the first meeting in May.
Well, I was wondering if it may not be ready, obviously, but if the sooner it's ready, the sooner we have it, the sooner we can be intelligent about it.
Probably about the best we can do on the actual book with all
Okay.
that detail, but we'll.
Take a look.
At your next meeting, I'll be presenting our budget pre-look.
Okay, well, maybe we can talk from there then. I'm
Yeah.
just thinking from the standpoint of we've got the some hiring efforts that are going on.
Yeah.
We've got the U.S. Open, and we've got some other things. Advance time is very helpful. And no, that was the one item I wanted to bring up. Anybody have other items or things they want to have on our next meeting's agenda in particular? Is there anything in particular we have? Well, I gather next time we'll actually see a proposal from our architects on the library issue. Is there anything other of significance that'll be on that
Next
agenda?
meeting agenda?
Yeah.
Are we, just with respect to the architects, are we resolved that either if we haven't exceeded our scope, or if we have, that we have negotiated whatever we need to?
It's not costing us anymore.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. But we would hope to see that April 9th, I think, is the next
At
meeting.
your next meeting as well, yeah.
Great.
Anyone have any other expectation or something they would like to be sure we have on the agenda going forward? It doesn't have to be next week, but let staff know now. It can be next month.
Mentioned an U.S. Open update. I don't know when that would be appropriate.
Doug's off right today, so, soon, I'm not sure,
Soon's
probably not
good.
next meeting, but
They're presenting to NAC in April, which will be after our first meeting, but before our second meeting, so maybe the
an
second
update
meeting.
on that, yeah.
Is there any new updates on the amenities, downtown amenities issues? None? Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you. Others, Barb, no? Jack, anything else from you?
Not right now, no.
Okay, John Taylor, do you have
All
anything
set?
else? Okay, anything else you need to advise us on and so forth? No? Okay. Dr. Morgan, all the best to you, safe travels. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Good night. I have a motion,
Move to adjourn the work session?
Second.
adopted, thank you.